Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for making it to the final day of the Festival of Para Academia. I have known Martin for many years now, in one way or another, from courses he's done at the MSCP to like the brilliant work he's done in setting up the Independent School of Philosophy, and it's been a roaring success in recent times. It's become an established part of the philosophical scene in Melbourne, and I'm very pleased and honoured and proud that Martin came on board and is participating today. And I trust Martin, another exile from the academy, will be able to talk about his experience, his school, or he might even avoid all that and just get into his presentation. But can we please give Martin a round of applause? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you very much for breaking Melbourne intellectual protocol Sunday morning. That's very, very many obstacles to overcome. For those of you who don't, some of you have been to the school and know all about it, but for those of you who don't, our basic reason for being is to gather between usually 5 to 25 people in a class and just read a classical work of ancient or modern philosophy or of philosophical literature. Just as an example, in the last year we've read together and discussed Plato's Symposium, Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics, and we just spent 12 weeks on Sophocles' Antigone, Shakespeare's Hamlet. That's last year, and this year we'll be reading Plato's Apology, Sophocles and Parmenides through an essay by Heidegger, Euripides' Bacchae, and we also have a few courses in ancient Greek, which I'm going to try and justify shortly. So our basic activity is just to have become acquainted with or read a book and turn up and discuss. I want to try and justify that activity with a complicated universal history of philosophy. But I thought I'd just very briefly indicate how I arrived at it, which is much less important, but just to show you my orientation, and you can adjust for my prejudices. So my experience at high school was that I escaped over the barbed wire with 2 books. I had an English teacher who opened up a Thomas Hardy novel, Merrick Casterbridge, and I found in a desk Catcher in the Rye, which I immediately stole and read. And as a depressed teenager, I found this book about a depressed teenager enthralling. And I went and wasted a year and a half doing things like law and commerce at a university, but just started to read more. And as I read more, the people you read, the people who you find very enthralling, you might have a month where you read all of Jane Austen or all of Hemingway or whoever it is. And they always point back to other people. And so you end up with someone who was at the peak, like a Proust or a George Eliot and Shakespeare. And reading these things, I was able to do this because I worked in a bookstore. That's because we used to have these things called books that were widely available, and you could hold them and things. And I wanted to understand what made certain works attractive. Like if you read King Lear and you find, as I found, Kent and Cordelia to be beautiful human beings that I admire, but I want to understand what that nobility means and why they have to be destroyed, right? Kent is not destroyed, Cordelia and King Lear are destroyed. And so I went back to university and I studied to study English, because in my first encounter with the university, there were no human beings visible except maybe in case precedents in part of contract law. But in English, we have living human beings with real dilemmas, admirable characteristics, etc. Now, when I went back to the university, the fashionable thing in the English department was to reduce everything interesting and human to some other phenomena, some not specifically human phenomena. For example, economics or Freudian psychoanalysis, etc., etc., etc. And I find that uninteresting, because it says, here's a specific reaction that you have to a personage or a book that it's beautiful or just or noble, and they're saying, no, it's this other phenomena that's not specifically human. And so what I noticed, though, when you read the works that this kind of literary criticism comes from, in every one of them, on page 39, there's a footnote saying the reason why I refer to the entire history of philosophy as a metaphysics of presence or Platonism is see Heidegger Being in Time, or see Nietzsche Twilight of the Idols or something. And so I soon came to realize that if I wanted to understand why this kind of criticism wasn't very inspiring, and if I wanted to combat it, I had to deal with people on that level. And then if you go back to people, Heidegger and Nietzsche, who inform all of these more recent works, then you find that their works depend entirely upon a critique of classical philosophy, in Heidegger's case, a reworking of Aristotle and a polemic against Plato. In Nietzsche's case, it's more Plato, but similarly. And so then I thought, okay, I'll just spend 6 months on this classical philosophy stuff, and then I'll come back, refute these people, and then I'll keep reading Shakespeare and maybe write an essay. What I found, though, first of all, you have to learn the language, and that's an infinite task. And secondly, the works of the classics are of such breadth, beauty, and profundity that I didn't want to come back. So So that was my rough orientation. So I changed course from English to philosophy. Unfortunately, I noticed there was none in Australia at that time. Just to do justice, when I went to Melbourne Uni, there was a lecturer there called Marion Tapper, with whom I studied two very important works for the first time: Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and Heidegger's Being in Time. It was the first time I read those two books through. But I was undertaking a two-front war against analytical philosophy and against continental philosophy, so I wasn't ready to appreciate her work. But I do appreciate her. She was a very generous teacher, and I want to memorialise her because she passed away last year. Anyway, so I ended up studying with, there were two philosophers alive when I was trying to find a scholarship somewhere. And one of them, Seth Benedetti and Stanley Rosen. Seth Benedetti died, so I went to study with Stanley Rosen in Boston, and I lectured there at Boston College, Suffolk Uni, and Boston University for a few years. Came back to Australia, and I noticed that things weren't getting better in the humanities. We have universities where you can find cures for almost any kind of disease. There are dictionaries of lost languages. There are engineering capacities to build amazing structures, but we can't sit down and read a few books about what would be the best way to be happy or excellent, which is a fundamental desire we all have in whatever variety of ways we express it. That's a fundamental human desire. And that impulse, like how would I be excellent or happy or more just to people around me, etc., etc. That's the animating principle of classical philosophy. And so, given that situation, about four years ago, with help of some friends, all of whom were originally students when I taught here 20 years ago, we set up the Independent School of Philosophy, and have carried on studying these books. Now, so that's a limited. Everything personal is tragicomic and not of particular significance. We now turn to the universal. I've lectured at half a dozen unis for many years. This I can honestly say is my third PowerPoint. And last night, someone who understands these things looked at it and said, "You've got 30 slides, each one with 500 words. You're going to have to make some changes." So I have tried to adapt to the 21st century and limit the amount of extraneous material. I can do that, can't I? It's amazing. See, I've taken away all of the 5 quotes from Aristotle, and that's us. So since 1918, that's actually where my mind is, but since 2019, we've had about 8 to 12 classes, and on a variety of topics, like I mentioned, Nietzsche, Kant. Next year we're doing a Kant. The preferred mode is there's one text, and we're all going to read it in our 2 hours together, I'll read a few passages, or someone will read a few paragraphs, and we'll just discuss its meaning. I definitely have an interpretation, but like everyone's interpretation, it's entirely open to refutation and questioning, and that's the whole point. And I myself personally, and I think all of you find this when you've read something and you offer an interpretation. We learn the most when someone says, "Well, I disagree for the following 17 reasons," because then you have to think through what you've propounded. Okay. Okay. So this is my polemical justification for the existence of the school. We have to read philosophy and philosophical literature and anti-philosophical literature, and I probably should make a bit clearer what I mean by these basic terms. So philosophy, as originally understood, meant the discovery of something like nature. Now, the fact that we think or understand the word nature to mean non-human organic matter or something, that's a sign of the enormous change in the meaning of philosophy and our whole orientation to the world since the ancient Greeks, who discovered the notion of nature and developed it in various ways. And we radically changed that through the Enlightenment or early modern thinkers like Descartes, to think of nature as being non-human external matter subject to mathematical laws. That's our understanding of nature, right? Whereas originally, the discovery of nature is that which provides a standard for thought and action outside human making and imagination. Right? So every political community, for example, has principles of justice, and there's some act of human making involved in that. So there's two possible stances you can take. Well, it's just a fiction. Each city has its own fictions, or one's true and all the rest are false. So there's three stances. The third, which is the classical point of view, is that by nature there is a standard of human justice of how you should treat other people, and each city has a more or less full, more or less adequate version of that. It's a fiction, but it's a fiction made in the light of a natural standard. Now, this could all be completely wrong, but I just want to explicate what the original notion is. So therefore, our justification for the school is A, if you don't study modern philosophy, we cannot understand our own lives and our society and our world, because we are living in the midst of a partially failed, partially successful, massively influential philosophical project. I use the word project because it's Francis Bacon who was one of the two most important people for this project, and who invented this use of the word project, obviously derived from the Latin projectio, but project. And the document for the Enlightenment would be the Encyclopedia of the Arts and Sciences, edited by Diderot in the 18th century. If you read the introduction to that, he points immediately to Bacon and Descartes as the general of the army of thinkers who propounded the Enlightenment. I think that's exactly right. It's Bacon and Descartes who are the key. But anyway, so to understand our world, and for example, why we think of nature in a certain way, or if you're concerned about the exploitation of nature, etc., that all comes back to these early modern thinkers. And that's one justification. But for me, the far more significant justification is that the classics may well be right, that just the activity of thinking things through for oneself and with others is itself one of the major fulfillments of human life. And I have a quote here from Aristotle attesting to that, which I'm going to read. So Aristotle, this is in the book 10 of the Ethics. Ethics means related to character. And it's a book because all human beings end up with a character, just whatever habitual way of life you end up in. And he's trying to understand those characters to say, well, which one brings us excellence as the key to our happiness? And by book 10, he answers his question in apparent contradiction to the middle books, where he says, the happiness from certain practical political activities is secondary. The primary happiness is that of philosophy, or thinking things through. And he says that on this basis. he's talking about the intellect, and he says that our nous, our intellect, exceeds everything else in power and importance, and its activity would seem to be what each person is, since it's the authoritative and better part of us. It would be strange, therefore, if someone were to choose to live not their own life, but the life of someone else. Now, this is striking for us because we would tend to think that the universally intelligible things, the things that the intellect can grasp, are the least our own. What is most our own is something particular, right? But I think this may be true. Aristotle and Plato never ask you to forget what is your own particular background, the language that you're born with, and the other things that make you a part of a particular community. You never forget your individual particular self, but that particular self is illuminated most by the activity of the intellect, which has a universal power. I think, therefore, that the classics are far more complex than modern philosophy. I mean, there's a lot of tedious work going into reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. But a lot of that extreme complexity, linguistic complexity, is not just partly because he's talking about something that's not possible, but it's because, like many other moderns, he's seeking for a universal system. He doesn't begin from where the human being begins, but there's nothing more complex than where we begin from, our openness to the whole of existence. And so I think the classics are actually more complex than the moderns. Okay. Now, the reason why I stole a few words from a document called Plato's Apology of Socrates, which is Plato's defense speech for Socrates, which, if you don't know, there's no particular reason why you should have read this recently, but yeah. Socrates is the first classical philosopher who was put to death for not believing in the gods of the city, introducing new gods, daimonia, and corrupting the youth. And when he gave his Greek trials had two different parts. First, prosecution and defense speeches, and then before the sentencing, a speech by the defendant and the prosecutor about what the sentence should be. In the second part, Socrates provokes his own execution by insulting his audience in the following manner, by telling them that he cannot give up philosophizing. So he's on trial basically for philosophizing, questioning the gods of the city and so forth. And he says, I won't give this up. And then he says this. And he says, this is the most difficult thing of all to persuade some of you. Could be Plato, Plato's in the audience. So Plato, who writes this dialogue, is in the audience. Because if I tell you that this is to disobey the god, now, in the first part of the speech, he's pretending that his philosophical project is dependent upon an oracle from Apollo at Delphi. But it's clearly a made-up story for reasons we can't go into now. And it's impossible for that reason to keep quiet. You won't be persuaded on the grounds that I am being ironic. Ironic means to lie, basically, in ancient Greek. But in Plato, it takes on a particular colouring in another dialogue called The Lovers. Socrates himself is sitting in a classroom and he's watching one boy discuss with another, and he says, the boy spoke very ironically, intending to mean one thing to one person and one thing to someone else. Right? And that's the origin of our understanding of irony, in a sense, that you intend different things to different people. And that's also Plato's indication of how to read him. Right? He's writing on 15 different levels for 15 different kinds of person. That's why the Platonic dialogues are usually named after people, because they're kinds of character that are being illuminated. So if, on the other hand, I tell you that it actually happens that the greatest good for a human being, not a citizen, not an Athenian, not a Persian, not an Egyptian, a human being, right, is this: to make speeches each day about excellence and everything else that you hear me conducting dialogues about in examining both myself and others, and that the life without such examination is not worth living for a human being, you will be still less persuaded by my saying that. But I affirm that it is true. Men, because it's a jury of men only. But to persuade is not easy. Okay, so that's a striking suggestion. So he's saying by nature for a human being, not for a man or a woman or a person enculturated in some particular way, for a human being per se, or whatever characteristics and so on, there is one activity that's the best. That's by nature. But we all are members of a community, and he refers into early in this dialogue to the notion of excellence of a human being and of a citizen. And here he's indicating that these things are different. What makes you a good citizen may not make you a good human being. Right? If you think of a regime that you particularly disapprove of, a good citizen might be a bad human being, whereas someone who revolts against that regime may be a good human being but a bad citizen, and so on. But this is the claim that Socrates makes, and as I may have suggested on this next slide. Sorry? Just a footnote to this fact that Socrates is separating the excellence of a human being and a citizen. This same teaching has been quietly propounded in many different traditions, in the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, in the modern tradition, and in the tradition of Islamic philosophy by Al-Farabi, possibly the greatest of the Islamic philosophers, who, when he very, very quietly makes very quiet but profound points, and when he discusses Plato's dialogues, he names the apology of Socrates, and within a page, he then renames it the protest of Socrates against the Athenians. And what he's suggesting, and what he makes clearer in the context, is that philosophy depends upon a kind of critique of the accepted opinions, convictions, laws that the philosopher is a member of the community, that are governed by those principles. Whoops, over there. Okay, so So this quote, "The life without examination is not worth living for a human being," I've noticed that sort of in proportion that a university brochure has like a part of that disappearing proportion of sandstone buildings on the brochures, it also has something like this quote in the philosophy department handout. And I find that odd because I don't think anyone believes that at any university on earth. And in fact, I think it might be illegal to think that. And I think for these reasons. One, it's impossible because you cannot pursue the truth because there's no truth. All truth is relative to some ground or other, culture, language, linguistic structure, history, etc. And it's wrong because texts reproduce historical prejudices. They cannot illuminate the truth for us now. And I don't agree. And I think it's of great value to read these ancient texts. Now, what I want to say immediately is that to think, as I think, that we can read a classical text by Plato written in roughly 380 BC, and that should inform our life now, does not mean that there's any political arrangement historically ever that one is advocating. Because as I've tried to suggest so far, the search for the principles of human thought and action means the critique of all political institutions. It's the attempt to discover standards by which you might critique any institution, including one's own. So it's not the propagation of a particular political stance. I just suggest that because particularly following the wild success of Nietzsche and Heidegger following Hegel in suggesting that all thought is historical, many people think that if you want to read a book from 1640 or 470 BC, it's because you favour some of the historical political arrangements of that time, and that's an historicist suggestion which I'm not making. Now I mentioned that philosophy understands itself originally to be the discovery of the notion of nature, that is, principles of thought and action that stand outside in Greek, physis is nature, from which we get physics, and that gives you a clue as to how far our understanding of nature has shifted, because physis means principles of thought and action, and for us, physics is the mathematical measurement of matter moving in space, right? No in principle, nothing is better or worse, beautiful or ugly, etc. So it's a radically different notion that we now experience. Now, from the classical point of view, though, the aspects of convention, law, custom, habit, etc., that dominate particular communities are the result of art or fabrication or construction. But where they differ from our contemporaries, who would say, well, therefore, these principles are merely a matter of social construction, Aristotle or Plato would say they definitely are constructed, but they are a construction that you can measure according to a natural standard. And that's why Aristotle in physics has this summary of that thought by saying that art, techne, completes nature, meaning that human beings have a natural propensity in a whole variety of ways for doing things that are excellent, beautiful, just, noble, and that lead to their happiness or unhappiness or misery, and that they get there to some degree through things like art, habit, practice, law, custom, which are partial completions of that. And part of one of the arguments that Aristotle makes for this is language. Every human being has the capacity to think in the language, but it's developed in radically different ways, and some languages do some things better than others, and so on. Art completes nature. I'm happy to be interrupted any time if you have a... I'm sorry?
You could read language there, you could read art as language.
Well, yeah, the fact that we have a particular, we're expressing ourselves in a particular language that articulates the world very differently, say, from Latin or German, right? That means that, we're using a particular constructed medium to instantiate a natural ability, which is that both of us are able to think and speak. Yeah? Yeah. Now, this 87-page extract from the Phaedo, I'm just going to tell the situation of this quote, and this is meant to be something that tells against the contemporary or modern tendency to reduce human experience to what is not specifically human, to reduce human actions and character to, for example, socio-economic relations or psychology or whatever. Socrates, when he was Plato writes a dialogue called the Phaedo, depicting Socrates in prison about to die. And he discusses some of the thinkers who came before him, who we now, this argument was so persuasive, we now call those thinkers pre-Socratic, right? They're pre-Socrates. And part of Socrates' argument is that these thinkers reduce human phenomena to, for example, bodily phenomena, but you could also say history or whatever. And he says, if you wanted to explain the cause of my sitting here talking to you and being about to die, you could do it by saying, well, he actually uses the word neuron, but it means joint, doesn't mean synapse. You could refer to my bodily parts and their activity and the air that moves in and out of my mouth and so on. But that wouldn't be the true cause. The true cause is that it was my opinion. There's a Greek word, doxa, which means opinion, which I'll come back to in a minute. But it was my opinion that it was more just and more noble to stay here and accept the penalty of the city than to run away, because the previous night a friend of his had bribed the guard, turned up and said, I've got the ute parked outside, the engine's running, we can go. And he made an argument, no, I'm going to stay and take the penalty. So what he says is that a lot of these thinkers have mistaken the condition for the possibility of the cause of human action for the cause. And what he means is that the cause of human action is your opinion that it's better in a variety of senses. It's more profitable, it's more pleasant, it's more useful, it's more just, it's more noble, for whatever reason. But human beings act because they think it's better to do so than worse. And if you have a philosophical theory that elides that experience, then you have to throw it out and start again, because your basic impulse to produce a philosophical theory comes from the fact that it's your opinion that it's better to do this than to do something else this morning, right? Where are we? Okay. Now, philosophy, because it doubts, it can only proceed through opinion. Otherwise, we begin with an abyss, which several prominent modern philosophers do. But if you don't do that, they argue that we have to begin with our opinions about things in order to try and to sort out what might be true about things. And that means that philosophy is inherently revolutionary, because if you want to see that in action, read books 2 and 3 of the Republic, where Socrates discusses with a few young people what a just city might be. The first thing, they throw out the entirety of their Greek heritage. All the gods go, and they replace that with an entirely different teaching. That's a revolutionary act. It's not meant to be a political or practical act. The whole point of the Republic is anti-political. It's in order to encourage you to philosophize, as becomes clear by Book 9 and 10. But at this point, it shows the revolutionary possibility of saying we will rely only upon our human intellect, and we will critique the nomos, the customs, the law that we were born into. But so I'm calling, therefore, the emergence of philosophy the covert philosophical revolution, because it is meant to refine the particular customs, standards, principles, values that a people has. It's not meant to extirpate it and start again. But there's only been my suggestion, open to refutation and ridicule, is that there have only been 2 revolutions: the discovery of philosophy, that is the discovery or invention, as Nietzsche would say, of natural principles of thought and action, and the modern revolution, which is not covert but overt, and is intended and did have a practical political effect. So I'm still not sure. So modernity, right, the second revolution, and the one that's actually, in fact, politico-theological, to cite the title of Spinoza's treatise, which was intended to split the political and the theological. So we like to think of modernity as involving many revolutionary acts. These are all distant echoes of the original revolutionary act, which was that committed by people like Bacon and Descartes as the most important. Bacon gave us the end of the Enlightenment, the end as in the purpose. And Descartes gave us the mathematical physics as the basis, which was later completed by Leibniz and Newton and so on. But the Enlightenment, because I'm going to make the following suggestion, that these very powerful thinkers who have remade the world have left us with a dilemma, and that's led to the partial success and partial failure of the Enlightenment. And that's because, this is obviously a radical simplification. I'm happy to have qualifications and objections. There are 2 aspects. One's political and human. That is, the end of human life is hedonism. Political hedonism is that collectively we strive after our own pleasure and convenience and so on. You can see this extremely clearly, in Hobbes and Locke. And Locke, obviously, the most important modern political philosopher for modern regimes. Part of the second treatise on government was just cut and pasted for the American Declaration of Independence and so on. Extremely important. And then you look at Locke's second treatise, where he's discussing the foundation of political right, and he accepts Hobbes' view that we are by nature asocial or antisocial. So therefore, the construction of a community is a social contract. We are no longer, as Aristotle thought, political animals. That is, animals that need a political community in which to be excellent and happy. We make a deal for the sake of utility and convenience and survival, right? Now that's the most successful political project known to humankind, right? That is now has been widely accepted and is taking over the globe. Now, on the other hand, also wildly successful is the notion of a modern progressive science, that is a science that does not reverse itself, that becomes more and more powerful. And the end of that was given by Bacon. He summarized what is the end of science? What is the purpose of thinking? The classics thought, as I've suggested, that in some respects, we actually find fulfillment in just thinking things through for ourselves, together with friends, and that friendship is possible because if there is a truth, or at least if there is a genuine aspiration towards the truth, then you can have a perfect common good with someone else. So if you're discussing some issue and someone corrects you, you gain, you don't lose from that correction. And if you share something that you have found and someone else sees that to be true too, you don't lose from sharing that. There is a perfect common good only in the aspiration for the truth, and therefore there is possible, in theory, a perfect friendship among human beings. And for the classics, the political community is a reflection of that possibility. For the moderns, there is no such possibility. Right? We are by nature at war. The 13th chapter of Hobbes' Leviathan. We are by nature, life is by nature nasty, short, British, etc. Because we're conflicting over these bodily goods against one another by nature, and so we make a social contract to respect one another's rights, in order that we can pursue our selfish interests. What is in the Federalist? Hamilton says something like, "The purpose of government is to protect the unequal distribution of the power of making money," or something like that. It's a useful aim that you are allowed and to pursue within certain degree of freedom. Okay, now the problem here is that there is no strict relation between the science and the political hedonism. And that means we cannot justify with our new notion of what knowledge is our way of life. And that leads to these two aspects of the Enlightenment undermining each other. Now here we have a picture of the destruction of an entire generation which will never produce poetry, art, literature, and so on. And then above that, a picture of World War I. Right. Now, part of the reason we're reading these ancient texts is because I'm suggesting is that they contain at least as much, if not more, wisdom than some of the modern texts. We read Sophocles this year, and in the second choral ode, he says, the human being, having the device-contriving power of technology. I'm translating, is the Greek word techner, from which we get technology. A techner is an art or a skill like carpentry, up to statesmanship, founding a city, making laws. But its fundamental meaning is to have a skill that you can produce something that's useful, right? So I'm translating as technology for this purpose. So the human being has having the device contriving power, mechano wen, technes, as a kind of wisdom beyond hope. So beyond our current expectations of what we have the capacity to produce devices that will produce what is useful. But next line of the verse, at one time the human being goes to bad, at another time to good. So what Sophocles has seen and put into this ode is that the techni, the arts and sciences, are, we would say, morally neutral. So you can invent the power of nuclear technology and it can be used to power cities or to destroy cities, right? That science, the science that allows you to produce the technology, doesn't tell you how to use it. And that's the problem of technology, right? We have vastly enhanced power over non-human nature, but increasingly over human nature, and we do not have more guidance about how to use it. And so this radically increased power is going to be used as it is being used. Like everyone knows that, like we all live in our own little media silos, and I'm continually told things that reinforce my own extreme political beliefs, and unless you make extraneous efforts, the same is happening to all of us. And those things are manipulated, obviously, by the companies and governments who fund them. So the problem of the Enlightenment is the problem of technology, and two of the key claims to the Enlightenment, I think, have been proved false. The first, and this is a quote from both Bacon and Descartes, that the invention of a powerful science of technology to master nature for human benefit will benefit all and harm none. They both use this phrase. I don't know if we can say that's true. Now, and Mill and Kant, this is also a quote that they both use in different contexts. That we, in the case of, different contexts, but they're both talking about our moral and political progress, that we are making irreversible progress. And I think that's obviously false from about 17 minutes past 6 on August 18, 1914. But at the end of the 20th century, it's just obviously false that we are making irreversible progress, right? Which means we're in the place that we've always been, which is that we have to be intelligent, right? We can't rely on historical progress and so on. Now, after the kinds of disasters that the progress of technology without any commensurate progress in our practical intelligence and our political intelligence, after those disasters of the 20th century and during them, and Nietzsche prior to them, right, many thinkers have decided that the calculative reasoning that goes into modern science and technology is destructive itself, and therefore reject reason as a guide to human existence. And I've got two examples. One from the dominant, in the English-speaking world, a school of philosophy called analytical philosophy, which sort of runs along after science, saying what philosophy is sorting out into a predicate calculus of the fundamental concepts of whatever it is you're doing now. So that analytical philosophy will obviously make itself redundant, and it's already being replaced by what is called continental philosophy. It must do so, because if you're saying that all thinking is analysing, you have to begin with some terms. How do you know those terms? Well, they're just part of our ordinary language or our ordinary experience, but doesn't that change from epoch to epoch? It inevitably becomes historicist. The continental philosophers are therefore have an advantage in self-understanding over the analytical philosophers, because they're at least examining the human context within which science occurs. The problem is that they accept the modern character of science as being neutral to every category of what's better or worse, noble, base, just, unjust, and so on. I've got an expression by Nietzsche of that, but there's no need to look into particular. But just to suggest that the sources of much of what we call continental philosophy or postmodern philosophy accepts the modern view of reason and rejects reason on that basis. Whereas I'm suggesting that what we need is to expand that notion of nature and of reason rather than reject it per se. That's sort of rhetorical. Don't worry about that. I thought a point I tried to make earlier was that the classics are as aware as we are that what is vitally important to a particular person and to a people is their own experiences and their own expressions of that in poetry and song and works of art and so on. But on the other hand, they are saying that you illuminate that particularity by the use of the intellect in its broadest capabilities and prospects. And one of the most beautiful expressions of that is by W.E.B. Du Bois. You say Du Bois, by the way. It's not Du Bois. I made this mistake in the US. Got corrected. Actually, a student of mine in a class at Boston College, she was in the Sierra Leone committee on campus, and she said I was teaching a course, it was an introductory course on philosophy of the human person. So we had Shakespeare, Swift, Plato, Aristotle, and so on. And she said there are no people of colour in this list. And I said, if you have a text that you think is in conversation on something like these questions and this level, then please bring it. And she brought, and I'm very grateful that she brought me this book. And we spent a week on the souls of black folk, and it has this very, very striking articulation of what Du Bois wants for his people in the South post the American Civil War. Now, he's no one who's lived is more concerned with preserving the particular experiences, the injustices, the struggles, the works of art created by his people than Du Bois is. And he went round, he followed the northern armies and went and interviewed many people who had been enslaved and recorded their songs and the way they spoke, because he wants to preserve that. He wants to preserve that experience. But what he says here, and he's arguing with people who say, okay, to help these people, we have to give them more trade apprentices and so on. He says, fine, I agree to a point. So I'll read this. So he says, the function of the Negro College then is clear. It must maintain the standards of popular education. It must seek the social regeneration of the Negro, and it must help the solution of problems of race, contact, and cooperation. And finally, beyond all this, it must develop men. Above our modern socialism and out of the worship of the mass must persist and evolve that higher individualism which centres of culture protect. There must come a loftier respect for the sovereign human soul that seeks to know itself and the world about it, that seeks a freedom for expansion and self-development. That will love and hate and labour in its own way, untrammeled alike by old and new. Such souls aforetime have inspired and guided worlds, and if we be not wholly bewitched by our Rhine-gold, they shall again. Herein the longing of black men must have respect, the rich and bitter depth of their experience, the unknown treasures of their inner life, the strange rendings of nature they have seen, may give the world new points of view and make their loving, living, and doing precious to all human hearts. And to themselves in these, the days that try their souls, the chance to soar in the dim blue air above the smoke is to their finer spirits boon and guerdon for what they lose on earth by being black. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the colour line I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they come all graciously, with no scorn nor condescension. So, wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. The veil is his metaphor for the experience of being treated differently for being black. Right? Now, what I find, there's several things that I find very attractive about this, but one in particular is that he's got this balance between wanting to preserve the particular experience of this people and not just wanting to preserve it, but he thinks that looking to great paradigms of thought and poetry prior to him will allow him and his people to express their own experiences all the better. And I think that's true, and that's what we're trying to do. That might be roughly it, unless objections.
Yeah. So we've booked Martin till 1. There's 6 minutes. Martin, you can't wiggle out like this. But anyway, in all seriousness, does anyone have any questions or comments for Martin?
Yeah, no, Martin, I mean, I think we've all read a few different books sort of trying to grapple with why are we at where we're at in the world at the moment, right? But to me, you have a slightly novel take on this, and it simplifies a lot of the buzz around, and I'd love you to put this into a transcript that is widely circulated, that's all. I really enjoy the way that you put things and the way that you clarify the issues. And we would do people an enormous service if we put this in the hands of first-year philosophy students, big time. So thank you very much, and your project is very important.
Thanks, Annie. That's very kind.
Thanks, Martin. That was brilliant. I'm really curious. Like, what would be your vision or understanding of what the universities and philosophy departments ought to be doing if they did accept the Socratic maxim and this sort of critique? And what would it look like? What would courses be doing instead?
What we're doing, but I mean, in doing what we do, it was. I mean, I partly have in mind St. John's College in the States. Have you heard of this place? It's a great book school, and they don't call their teachers professors; they call them tutors. And a tutor sits with a class, and the class just raises questions themselves and discusses, and the tutor might guide it. Now, I don't do that when we have a discussion. I do offer an interpretation, entirely open to rejection, but that's just, because some people want to just listen, some people want to engage, and some people have a life and don't have time to read it, and so they can hear a paragraph or two and then talk, so it's a different mode. But that notion where we just go back to the most profound sources of our A, political historical situation, and B, human situation, and just read them together. I think that's, but this is exactly what used to happen. A tutorial. When I was, tutoring classes on the way through various graduate, postgraduate things, you could sometimes tutor a class of 30 people or something. And when I was lecturing in an ethics class in first year, it might be 150 people. You can't have a conversation with 150 people beyond what's your name. You can't do that. And now, whereas traditionally, a tutor is 2 people and a lecturer is 5. Right? So something like that is ideal, because you don't understand. I mean, this is different from if you're studying quantum physics or if you're studying marine biology. That's not as necessary. But for studying something in the humanities, it's absolutely necessary that you articulate what you think all the way through, just to sort out, just because you haven't understood it until you can articulate it yourself. Because we're not dealing with something that can be put into a 3-part, what do you call those things? Multiple choice. Right? It's a matter of understanding something much broader than that. And so, a return to that kind of, first of all, the direct dealing with these texts, not through the prism of every class I went through as an undergrad, seething with anger, was preceded with the following phrase: I will now give you the historical context. Which means Hobbes did not understand the truth. He just represents the truth of his time. So what does that mean? Doesn't that mean that the lecturer also is expressing only the thought of their own time, and I can dismiss all of you and express the thought of my own? I mean, just endless self-refuting notion. So I think we need to put that aside, put aside that sophistication, and just approach these texts originally. Yeah.
Just with the title of the talk, I was just wondering, did you mean happiness? Like, what was the title again? It was is that what you were referring to, or?
Thank you for pointing out my total failure to indicate what it is I'm talking about. No, that's very good. Because Socrates says that the activity that I do, discussing excellence and the things you hear me talk about every day. He means like that activity of examining myself and others. So philosophical reflection.
Yes.
So he's saying that's the greatest good for a human being.
Because I just think, like, I'm an artist, and I feel like a lot of us spend a lot of time alone, and I think you get happiness through a lot of reading and internal thought, but it's also a lot of loneliness and torment sometimes. So it's just an interesting kind of idea about, with learning more, you're trying to talk about philosophy and stuff, and are you happier or more depressed?
This is,
Yeah, I don't know. That's maybe a bit too deep, but yeah.
No, that's excellent. But a lot of modern philosophy is extremely exciting initially. Like, say you began to read Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Joyce, initially very exciting, but ultimately depressing, because the world they describe is meaningless. Meaning is created, it's accidental, or it's fate, or whatever. And I'm not saying that I know the truth and they're wrong, but I'm just saying if that's your orientation, that it can be hard to bear. And that's why I find the argument. Now, I went back to the classics thinking, I'm going to find some answers, come forward and deal with these. But they don't. There are no answers such that I was searching for. There is the search for the truth, which does provide you with. You can learn a great deal from Plato about the character of human beings, politics, etc. Yeah, but there is no such thing from that point of view as a strict program of natural law that you can apply to practical circumstances. There is no answer like that. Yeah. But that possibility of philosophical friendship I find very appealing, and some of the best experience of my life have been reading and discussing books with people. And the person I was fortunate enough to actually meet a genuine philosopher, before he died in 2014, and every moment with him was wonderful. Just. No counter polemics. I'm happy to be refuted because I do express myself.
Well, we've got one more here. Maybe there's some refutation coming.
Yeah, good.
You said that Rosen was an actual philosopher. What do you mean?
I mean, someone who lived like that, as if the most important thing in their life was understanding, and also because, in my view, I stumbled across one of his books in a Melbourne Uni library and decided, well, that's where I'm going, if I can get there, and the reason being that he can think on the level of, if not above, Heidegger, Nietzsche, Descartes, Bacon, and he wrote a book on all of these people, and as well as 7 books on Plato, Aristotle. He can think on their level, but therefore he can discuss our problems because he can understand these various people and put them into dialogue and make it, and that's very rare. I mean, there are great scholars who I admire wonderfully who say great things about Kant or Aristotle, but very few people who are actually engaged in a conversation on that level with these people. Did I say there were T-shirts available in the... Actually, I do have some flyers if you're interested in the courses we're doing next. I'll put them in.
As you know, Martin, I'm into mathematical mysticism, and basically through Plato, and the essence of things is like the essence of geometry and mathematics and stuff. And so often when you're talking about modern, the post-Enlightenment thing and this kind of this reduction to mathematics and logic in a utilitarian, technological sort of way. I just wonder if if I can sort of make peace with you on that in terms of like Plato's what they were doing in the academy with their mathematics, which probably wasn't going towards actually changing the world and in the ways that that's happening now.
Yeah, the area for possible agreement is that mathematics was understood to be a theoretical science, say by Aristotle. For Plato, that's not quite the truth. But we do disagree about the role of mathematics in Plato. That's and you obviously have a very considerable. There's a considerable tradition that speaks to your side. Whereas, I think that, the central metaphors of the Republic, sun, line, cave, the line is meant to prove that mathematics provides an obstacle to philosophy. But so we're coming at the same thing from opposite points of view. We could find common ground in Aristotle. He says, there are theoretical, practical, and productive sciences. The theoretical ones are the highest because they're concerned with objects that don't change, mathematics, physics, and first philosophy. So therefore it's one of the highest sciences because it's theoretical, because it's therefore the end is knowing or contemplation, it's not production or practice. So that would be common ground.
Well, we nearly had some conflict and refutation,
Yeah.
but sadly not. So, look, can we put our hands together for Martin? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming along.